testamental period, wrote a lot of literature, and they recognized the same thing. They recognized that none of the kings in the line of David, even if they saw a initial application to them, they recognized that many of the things that were said seemed to point to something greater, something farther down the road, to where this one king, this one Solomon, or whoever it might be, was but a rather dim representation. And hence there was a lot of discussion amongst the Jews prior to the time of Christ of what these texts would mean messianically. They were looking for a Messiah because they didn't look at this and go, oh yes, there's a Messiah, it was one of the ancient kings, we're done. No. They recognized that there was something more. There would be a greater fulfillment. And certainly we know that Psalm 2 is used a number of times in the New Testament, where the New Testament writers will take these words and will make application to demonstrate that the one, ask of me and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance and the very ends of the earth possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. Well, how is Jesus described in one of the letters in Revelation as ruling over the nations with a rod of iron? And so it clearly became central to the preaching of the early church, the writing of the early church, that especially this text had its ultimate fulfillment, and could only have its ultimate fulfillment in light of how small Israel was in comparison to all the nations of the world, in the Messiah, and then, obviously, in the Messiah's rule and reign over the world through the kingdom, and that kingdom being his people. It wasn't a military conquest by army and an addition of territories and things like that. And so if we keep that in mind and recognize that, then possibly some light is shed upon our thinking that is forced upon us by, really these days, if we turn on a radio, if we turn on a computer, if we turn on a television screen, unless we're making a concerted effort to not listen to what's going on in our society and not listen to what's happening this evening in Philadelphia and so on and so forth, we cannot help but hear over and over again the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing. I mean, that term, I was actually looking a little bit more, I'm not sure why I did, but when I was looking at this, I looked a little bit more at the Greek than I did at the Hebrew, the Greek translation, the Greek Septuagint. The Septuagint sometimes does a really good job in rendering the Hebrew in certain of the Psalms. And the term here, a vain thing, is that standard term for something that's foolish or empty. Foolish or empty. And I cannot help but have been reminded, both last week and this week, in the conventions taking place, the vanity of man's wisdom outside of submission to God's truth. I don't care which side of the political aisle you're on. If you open your mouth and seek to engage your brain, and yet you are in rebellion against Him in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, some of the things that I've heard said by people on both sides of the aisle, vain things, empty things, just rhetoric and foolishness and such short-sightedness and no ability to see the relationship between this thing and that thing, because their worldview has no central focus. It has no way of holding all this together. So many people want to do something over here, and then they complain about things over here, and they don't realize that what they want to do over here would make things over here a whole lot worse. They don't even see how it's connected. Just emptiness, foolishness, vain things. And yet they seem to feel so wise. It's like we've thrown off the yoke, and that's exactly Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. Isn't that what we see around us in so much of the educational system? You know, we used to be bound by the worldview that said there was a God and there are certain inalienable rights and they come from God because we are the creatures of God. We're made in His image. Human life has transcendent value. These are all the cords and the fetters of the old way of thinking. What's the term today? Progressive. Progressive. That's the term today. And it's like we are progressing from what? Away from the day of darkness when we were bound and fettered. Their cords of this old worldview held us back, and now we've broken through the glass ceiling. Yeah, that's what we've done. And I hear this over and over and over again. And it's all around us. And it says the kings of the earth take their stand. The rulers take counsel together. And so there's this elite. There's these people with power and authority. And there's no neutrality toward Yahweh and His anointed one. And when you think about it, what do we say that is so radically offensive to the world around us? It's our confession of faith. Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. And we shouldn't just mean that He's my personal Lord and that's just my snuggly feeling. That's true. But the proclamation is Jesus is Lord of all. Every nation, every person. He's the maker. He's the creator. It's in Him all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden. He's the one who made all things that are in heaven and earth. Every power and dominion and authority is under His control. And that is so offensive to these kings and these rulers who want to cast off these fetters. They don't want to be bound by the fact that they're creatures under the lordship of someone else. And they're going to be judged by that someone else. Oh, they don't want that. And so it is, I think, appropriate to point out that the only way to really see a full fulfillment of this type of taking a stand and taking counsel against Yahweh and against His anointed one is in the context of the ministry of Jesus Christ and then His resurrection into glory at the right hand of the Father. And then the proclamation of the church, it goes out and says, Jesus Christ is Lord, and He sends us into all nations. And He gives us authority. And it is that authority that they rebel against. They don't